My name is Brent Roberts. I'm the costume craft artisan and dyer at the Seattle Rep Theater. I've been there now 5 years and most of 6 seasons. And then before that, I was an assistant craftsperson at the LA Opera in Los Angeles and the Old Globe Theater in um, San Diego. And that's among many other random things to get to where I am today. So my path is a little different than a lot of people in theater. I went to a really small school that didn't have much of a theater program to speak of. So my love of it didn't really come from the theater route as most people's did. I started getting into cosplay, which now everyone listening to this, I'm sure knows what it is, but at the time no one really did. And so I just wanted to dress up like a Jedi from Star Wars. My grandma helped me make that costume. I learned some hand sewing and eventually um, through many other generous people who are willing to share their time on sewing machines, I sort of figured stuff out, made a few costumes. So by the time college came around, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew I was really passionate about making costumes and was really enjoying that. So I thought, well, let's see if I can make this a career, because I was always taught, the adage of do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And at this point, being at the Rep, it does sort of feel like that. I have to say, it is sort of a dream job, the one I wanted to get when I went out of college, and it's been pretty great. I've got to make a lot of fun things and, meet a lot of cool people along the way. I went to the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and I learned things there like millinery, dyeing, um, casting and molding classes with various chemicals, in addition to tailoring, pattern making. Um, there was not a leatherworking course, but I, at the same time, became friends with the manager of the local Tandy Leather in Milwaukee. And so he sort of at the same time was teaching me what he knew about leatherworking, which has become one of my favorite things to do in the craft sphere. So yeah, I just did a 4-year bachelor degree there, and it ended up being so valuable, um, and really getting to do that hands-on work. Yeah, it was great. And so after that, I worked around the city just doing wardrobe and stuff, just trying to get my foot in the door with theaters. And eventually those connections led to my first real crafts job at the LA Opera. So much of any job and any career path you go into is connections. So of course, always, I would say, talk to everyone, get to know them, what their path was like, and see if they know somebody that they can help, because that job started with me visiting LA, getting a tour of the space, and then next year they needed an extra assistant. And that's where I learned so much of what the actual working um, life is of someone that's in the crafts profession. It's an interesting path to sort of lead me to this as a job, because especially when I was in college, that was sort of the peak of my cosplay endeavors, if you will. And so when I would learn something in school, I would immediately apply that to whatever costume I was making at the time. And then for me, that was just, it was inspiration to actually put those skills to use, instead of just being like, okay, I learned this thing, I hope I remember it someday when I have a job. It was like, okay, this actually solves a problem I was just trying to figure out for this costume I'm making. And because I'm so passionate about that, you know, sometimes to my professor's chagrin, because I'd be like, look, I have to go out of town for a convention and miss your class. But I think in the end, I wouldn't have changed it, because it was like I lived and breathed and ate costuming for those years. And so I think some of my skills, like I mentioned with the leather stuff, that came sort of out of cosplay and out of my desire to learn that stuff for costumes. And now that I've been working in this position for a while, and you asked if I still do cosplay once in a while, it slowed down a lot. I think when your job is this, as great as it is, it's hard to have your hobby be the same thing as you get older. And so now I've shifted more to like Renaissance fair stuff, and I really enjoy that, just because it kind of pushes me into the design world a little bit more, which is new to me as someone who's been a technician. Crafts as a um, element of the costume shop, it is so different every day is different at the rep. The things you're asked to do can be literally anything. I mean, you have no idea what to expect. And so sometimes it's figuring that out without really any explanation from history, from pattern making, from anything. It's just like, how do you as an individual and all the collective knowledge you've accumulated tackle this? So that is a lot of what any crafts job is, and a lot of what my job is at the rep. So depending on the show, my workload varies, and that applies to everyone in the costume shop. And so it really can be anything. A lot of my job at the rep does involve dyeing, which is something that when I got that job made me nervous, because I think any crafts person will tell you that dyeing is, you know, it's a little bit of science, but it's like baking. It's like kind of a feeling. It sort of depends on the day, depends on the water content of the day. And, you know, I take a lot of meticulous measurements and try to upscale things, use formulas, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just need to sprinkle a little more in or take it out early, or, you know, so that's something that's a skill I've really developed since being at the rep, because many of our shows and designers really have a very specific vision of a color, and I'll try to get it as best I can. And usually these days it comes out pretty good. So, but that takes a long time to get there and learn those things. But other than that, like I said, hats is a big thing. Belts, you know, sometimes, most of the time it's choosing a leather belt we already have, but I've been able to make some really cool tooled and stamped pieces. It just really depends on the character, and also reading the script can sort of inform you on things. My favorite thing is when a designer really understands a character in the same way I read that character, and then I can sort of kind of add a little flair to what their outfit would be based on how they are as the character, with the little things that probably nobody notices, but it helps the actor, it helps the whole, you know, aesthetic of the show. So yeah, it's the reps space for crafts is one of probably the coolest space I've worked in personally. So I have a vent in my area where I can do some of that stuff, and then our scene shop also has a more closed off vent for even more toxic materials. So that's an important thing to have. And then we have a pretty decently sized dye vat, which is actually what they use in kitchens for making like a day's worth of soup or something like that. So it's a big metal cauldron essentially that heats up. I have two washers, one dryer. I have a steamer for making hats out of felt and straw and things like that. A recent acquisition that I pushed for because of all the distressing we just talked about was getting a heat press that heats pretty quickly up to, I think it goes up to like 400 degrees. I usually do it up to like 250, 275, and then it basically just flattens, or it heat presses distressing, because often you're doing a light touch or misting, you know, paint onto fabric, and that can sometimes wash out. And then just, I have another space that has a sewing machine, a bunch of hat blocks for shaping hats for all different head sizes, and industrial sewing machine, which sews through very thick fabrics and leathers, which is how I make a lot of the leather bags and stuff I like to do. And the big difference, of course, between opera, theater, and any stage um, and film and cosplay is that in film and cosplay, you either have an HD camera right up close examining your work, although that doesn't always mean the work is better. Um, and then cosplay, the same thing. You're having people literally just come up to you and pick at your clothes oftentimes. And so theater and opera and ballet too are mediums where the audience is further away. So in some aspects, you can get away with more things, if you want to put it that way, because the classic adage is it's 30 feet away and moving. But on the other hand, I've done some of the most detailed work, you know, that I've ever done on those, on theater and opera productions. And for example, with the Falstaff armor, I did like, I don't know, like 10 to 12 sets of that. And then they were all in the back, you know, you didn't even see them. So it's like, that's often how it goes, but it adds to that feeling of authenticity. I do a lot of distressing and weathering on costumes, and I got into that through cosplay as well, just because I thought it added something. It made my costumes, especially if it was a popular character, stand out from others that, you know, if you have a character that is, you know, an assassin or something, or, you know, like a pirate, and they have a white costume or like bright colored costumes, if you go to Joann's and just buy that fabric off the rack and make the costume, it can be as accurate as can be, but there's something about it visually that doesn't feel right if you really want to imagine what that character would look like. People may not see the little frayed edge on a collar, but there's something about that character that you just feel like, well, that guy definitely didn't just buy those clothes yesterday at Target. He's lived in them for 20 years, or this is his job. The way I go about it is, if it needs to have a color change, so often this applies to white fabrics, because there's bright stage lights on your stuff, any white and even dull white, and even if something looks sort of dingy or dull to you in person in your workspace, when you get it on stage, it could look basically angelic. So one of the things that a craftsperson does is having to tweak that white. And basically my first question when it comes to doing that in a dye vat is, do you want it, and the technical term for that is called teching a garment. Do you want it tacked down warm or cool? And basically that's gray or a taupe, you know, ecru sort of color. That's where I normally would start, is any direct treatment of the fabric, getting that layer of dye to make it look older. And then after that, I cover a block of wood, just like a 2x4 chopped like this from the scene shop with sandpaper, basically a sanding block. You can buy them pre-done too, but I just make my own. And then I like to go in and like smooth out the seams. Like a brand new shirt, the seams are gonna be really crisp. And if you're really careful, you can sort of fuzz out fabric, especially wools and stuff, so it has like a pilly look to it. Like they've had that jacket for a while. So I start with something like that, and then depending on the level of dirtiness, it's like I like to use airbrushing. Dynaflow is a great product to use in an airbrush. It's basically the consistency of water, and you can do good shading. And it's just sort of whatever the garment dictates, you know, that might get you a look that looks more like soot or coal, as opposed to like, you know, sort of just general dirtiness or like old sweat. I mean, it's kind of gross stuff, but it's like whatever sort of needs to happen. It's just some sort of paint. And then another thing I do now a lot is just put on vinyl gloves, like get my hands full of paint and just wipe it on clothes, basically just like as if I was wiping my hands, like if after a long day of work, you know, on the farm, in the factory, and pouring cement, whatever this character's backstory is. And a lot of times the script doesn't give you all the clues, so a designer might be like, this is the way I see this character. And so a good designer is able to sort of describe their vision to me, and I can be like, I know that person. Somebody I know is like that, you know, or like, you know, you apply it to your own life, or you just open your eyes as you walk around the city and see how people's clothes wear in all various states of their life. So. Yeah, leatherworking it covers a broad range of things you can do, and I try to sort of have my hands in all of them. Lately, I've been making leather bags, which I can show you. So this is sort of a bag that I made for my girlfriend, just sort of for fun. This is just cut out pieces. We have orange leather that I bought and yellow leather that I bought. It was already that color. And then this is what they would call, I think it's called an oily chap leather. It's for like saddles and stuff that really needs to go out in the wilderness with cowboys and things like that. So over time, this will wear to that nice, like, I guess you could call it patina leather look that you see on old leather bags, which is cool. And then, you know, it has a zipper here and a lining more with another internal zipper. So this is stuff that like is basically the same concepts as sewing. There's a pocket back here and strap and all the hardware and everything. So that's something, you know, the same principles of sewing a garment apply to that type of leather sewing. And I think a lot of people get afraid, or when I show them the leather bags I make, they're like, oh, I can't believe you can do this and stuff. And I always say, you know, if you can sew, and a lot of these people can make really amazing couture garments, it's just a matter of the cost of the leather, which is expensive. And there is no room for error in it as there is with sewing, where it's like if you mess up a seam, you can seam rip it out and redo it as many times as you want, as long as the fabric doesn't shred up or anything like that. With leather, you do see those holes, so if you kind of mess up, you're going to have that showing. And so to get to something like that bag, it's taken a lot of years and practice, but more than anything, it's having the right tools. And so that machine I was talking about that does stitch through, it's an industrial Juki machine, and a walking foot, so it can basically do this with the foot and pull your leather or thick fabric through and actually sew through that. Before that, I had made a few costumes out of leather with just a home machine, and I really put it through its paces, and you know, it's not good for it. It fights you and doesn't want to do it, and you have a lot of broken needles in the end of the day. But if you have the right tools and you're comfortable on them, and then it's just about making the pattern and getting everything to stay. One trick I have learned that I can share, this is sort of, I think I made this up, I don't know if I've ever seen anyone else do it, but is because you can't pin leather in the same way that you pin fabric if you're doing that, I usually give myself a little bigger seam allowance, like a 1/2 inch works, but you could even do 3/4 if you want to just be safe. And then I use like a heavy duty stapler, and I staple the seam allowance on the very edge of that together. That way I know, first of all, it fits, so it's not going to get messed up and I don't have to go back. And then when I'm done, I just take a rotary cutter or scissors and just cut that seam allowance down to a 1/2 inch if I want to stitch that seam open, or really close to the stitch line if it just wants to be gone. And so that has been a really helpful thing for sewing leather, because it's sort of I know other people use little clamps and they put a bunch of clamps. I do that sometimes, but that trick with the stapler works pretty well. So you figure out stuff like that. And then a lot of the tools you can use on something like this, it's like hole punching is a big one. So like I did this little detail of holes. That's just a regular punch that you put rivets in, which are would be the same as what you would use to put a rivet like that in. And rivets are pretty easy. You just punch a hole, put the rivet, two things together, and then just give it a whack with a hammer. That's the easiest way. There's other more refined ways of doing it, but honestly that way works just fine, and can get a lot done for you if you are getting into leather work. The other type of leather work would be tooling leather, you know, actually sitting away with harder veg tan leather, it's called. And that's the harder, more armored stuff. And so when you get that really wet, you can do a lot with just a hammer and different stamps that you put in. And I've been able to do some really cool belts and stuff at work and for cosplay with things like that. And that's also fun. So it's totally different, and that can be also sculptural. I've done these circular pauldron stuff for cosplay where I just found a medicine ball. I mean, so much of this job is just looking around in the world and being oh, actually I could use that as a tool, and it's not intended at all for what that is, but it works. And so, you know, you use pins and shape it much like you would a felt hat or something, but you know, wet leather you can really stretch and get cool shapes, which is how you see a lot of the armor done on stage and film. So there's two different ways, and you can mix and match and make a cool warrior or something, or just make a leather bag or anything like that. So the first one here is a strap cutter. You basically adjust where you want it to go, and that's how thick your strap is. On this side you can see there's little measuring, sorry about that, little measuring tools to tell how big you want the strap. So right here I have a strap that's kind of a practice strap. I have this is about 1 inch, so I'm going to take it to 3/4 inch just for a little bit to show you guys. So insert this end here and start pulling. As you can see, it starts going through, and you now have a 3/4 strap as opposed to a 1-inch strap. So that's our first tool, the leather strap cutter. The next tool that's very important for leather work is hole punches. You're going to use them all the time, whether you're punching holes for a design, like with this square hole punch that I have here, looks like this, or if you're punching them for utility, to add rivets, to add fasteners of any kind. Chicago screws are another one where the screws screw into each other. There's a lot of different things in leather work that you can do to adhere things. Rivets is a big one to keep things where they need to be, and they always need a hole. So I found the easiest hole punch is this. It has varying sizes that you can use depending on how big the thing you want to do is, and you can just take your leather strap like this, punch it through. You actually should be using a little leather under thing here to protect the punch, but I'm doing this in a hurry, so I didn't. But as you can see, you got a perfect hole. You're never going to get a hole that perfect trying to cut it or stab it with an awl or whatever else you want to do. So these are a godsend for leather work. Anyone who's serious about it should buy this instantly. You're going to use it every day. As I mentioned before, there's some decorative ones. I got these square ones mostly for using with hats or other leather projects. And they're kind of fun, but not useful. There's also circle ones in this style, so instead of using just pressure to punch a hole, as you do with this kind of hole punch, with these you're actually going to take a mallet or a hammer of some kind and just ram it right through your piece of leather. I'm not going to demonstrate that one today, but I'm assuming you get how that works. The next tools I'm going to show you are called stamps. So you get your leather really wet and you line this up to where you want it to be, and again, using a hammer, you go ahead and just pound it pretty hard, maybe I'd say like with a medium pressure hammer hit, and you end up getting stuff that looks like this. Again, this was my test scrap piece. I was trying out a few designs on it. So you can see here we've got a sort of flower design, which is the one that we have here, and that's kind of what it looks like as you stamp it into the wet leather. And I have sort of a triangle pyramid Illuminati type dealy thing here, and that's what I got here. So what I was trying to do here is line these up so you could do a diamond shape, but it also works just as a triangle and it'll give you that shape. These are nice. I just grabbed a star one too, that's another one. There's all sorts of them. Anytime you see a saddle or a lot of traditional type leather work, gun holsters, whatever, that stuff is gonna have a lot of designs where they use a bunch of stamps because it's really fast and easy, and in the end it gives you a really professional, cool finish look to your project. So they're really popular with traditional leather workers and new leather workers, if that's even a thing, alike, and always good to have a few. They're very expensive, so usually you buy one, it lasts you through a project, and then maybe if you have them lying around, you get more ideas so that you can use more later. The next tool and product I'm going to show you guys is called an edge slicker. They oftentimes look like this. They're just a disc of white plastic. And what you do with these is you go along the edge of a leather. So you see it's kind of rough. It starts out that way. You start with this called gum traganath. And I don't really know what that means, but what you do is you get a little bit, don't do this at home, but you put a little on the side, usually with a brush, not your finger, but I didn't think that far ahead. And get it so it's kind of wet. You can see how it's wet compared to the dry other piece of the leather side. And what this does is, like when you see belts that you buy in a store or professional, semi-professional leather work, oftentimes the edge is slicked and smooth as opposed to just purely squared off like this. And this is a nice cut on this leather, but oftentimes it's not going to look that pretty. So this is also another way to get a nice edge. So then you have your gum traganath on there. You take this and basically just do this a bunch until it gets smoother, and you do this along the whole edge, and by the end you'll have a smoother edge. Now I'm doing this on an unstained piece of leather. I'm going to show you guys what staining, how to stain leather as well. Usually you'd want to stain the leather before you do this, because if you do this before staining, what happens is it causes a resist to your dye, and you're going to have a lighter edge, which is typically not what you want. You want usually a darker edge, although if it's a stylistic thing, then that's a trick you could do also. So
This I didn't use a lot. I'd usually use a more liberal amount, but you can kind of see a difference. It's sort of more burnished on the edge than it started. The other trick you can do with this is by taking this tool. This is an edge beveler, and what you do with this, you go right here along the edge of the leather. So you just push this along, and you can kind of see that curly QM creating the leather. You go to the end. You have this little dangly leather piece here. And what this does is sort of, it angles the edge of the leather. So if you do this before you use the gum Dragonoff, you can get a really smooth and beveled edge, and that's a look a lot of people like to have on their leather. And the last, I'm going to show you guys some products here. This is Neat's Foot leather conditioner. This stuff is great. It's mostly the thing I use for any leather. You're mostly talking about veg tan leather, which is this kind of stuff. It's very stiff. They make saddles out of it, holsters, that sort of thing. That's a good product. We talked about dyes earlier. This is actually called an antiquing gel. And what this is considered more of a stain. So if you put this on leather, it's gonna give you a really vintage look to your leather. It's gonna go in all the cracks and flaws of it and kind of draw those out and make those darker. So this is how you get those effects. I would say like distressed leather, sort of cowboy looking leather, something that you want to look like it's had life and continue to get life as it ages. The other way you can dye leather, these are kind of the two main things I use personally. There's other things, is Phoebing's leather dye. There's other leather dyes. This is a brand that's been around a long time and I prefer using, but there's other ones, EcoFlow. Some are a little more eco-friendly, and they're all going that way now, which I think is good. But that's gonna give you a really nice look on your leather. This is just one more conditioner. If your leather's getting hard, or even if you buy a vintage piece from, an antique mall or something, you can grab some of this and the Neat's Foot that I mentioned before and use both of these to keep your leather looking new and supple and nice. So the last thing I'm going to show you all is just a piece I've been working on recently. This is a little leather band that I want to look really rugged and, that's had a life of its own and even has a little weird curly Q. So I've done some of the treatments I've described to this band using the EcoFlow Gel Antique on top to kind of draw out those dark areas in it. You can kind of see in some of the stamping there and on the edges and in the natural wrinkles of the leather. But originally this was sort of a bright orangish tan, so I kind of used those to create this sort of mahogany little band that's kind of scrappy looking. So this is going to be on a hat that I'm making, and so you can kind of see it all together. It's been conditioned as well, so it has that nice sheen. Another thing to get that sheen that I forgot to mention is if you use kind of an old t-shirt or rags that are made out of t-shirt, that kind of thing, after your dye is dried the first time, and you're all finished with all the dye treatments you want to do, use a rag like that and really burnish the leather until you get that nice shine, if that's what you're after. If not, it's pretty much good to go after you dye it. But I will say rubbing it with the t-shirt does make sure that no dye gets on your hands. There's other treatments that you can do after dyeing, but usually I stick with burnishing and the conditioner.
The last show with Emilio, which was, for me, ended up being one of the coolest things I've made. It was basically doing a scene from the Cotton Club nightclub. So it was like nightclub girls, feathery tails, and then like sort of headdresses with feathers and things like that. And so that was a really fun project with a lot of challenges and a lot of things I had never done before and sort of things to figure out. The designer really wanted the head pieces to be basically like skin tight to their head. And one of the challenges with that was one of the girls had really large hair, just more hair, and one of the girls had barely any hair. So of course, when you're making something fit someone's head and basically like have the illusion that they're bald, someone with no hair is obviously easy to make that happen on, as opposed to someone with more hair. So in the end, that was a cool challenge because, and also the two women playing those roles were just different sizes, different all sorts of things, but in the end needed to look uniform, of course, because they were supposed to be a similar dancing character. And so I think that challenge of each of those helmets, when you looked at them, looked totally different. The one didn't have a back in it, and the other one was just like a shell. But when they got on stage, they both looked the same. And I think the effect for both of them was the same, and they looked great. And so I think that was one of my favorite. I mean, it was a very challenging show and piece, and Kelly can talk more about that too since she was there. But I think those are sometimes the most rewarding, because in the end, you like showed you could do it and you didn't give up. This is a hat I made for Ren Fair, my Ren Fair character. A lot of people think it looks like the sorting hat, which it kind of does. But I basically kind of whipped this up quick because I was like, I had this idea for a character. I wanted it to be sort of witchy and magey and all that stuff. And so this is done with Foss shape, which I normally don't do. And you can kind of see in there, I didn't line it like I do a lot of my other stuff for professional theater. But since it was just me wearing it, I didn't bother to line it yet. And so this fuzzy material in here, it basically looks like batting, but it's called Foss shape. And it starts off as like almost like that foam, like if your mom ever decorated for Christmas and made fake snow villages, it kind of looks like that you like put down on the ground. But what happens when you heat it up with heat is it becomes solid, as stiff as something like, not necessarily leather, but like a felt or something like equally stiff for making hats. I did put some stuffing in here for the end of it, so this top part is a little looser, but then here it's really structured. And so like I made the folds, as you can see, in there. And then on the outside to cover it, I used this fabric, and I used fabric glue and sort of glued it in to look like that. The bottom is leather here, and again, just covered over the Foss shape. It has a little band on the lining that I did. That's just sort of a classic millinery band. And then feathers and buckles and all that stuff. Of course, you can also see some of the weathering I was talking about here, just sort of misting and dusting on the leather and, fuzzing out. I don't know if you can really see on the video, but yeah. So it's just one way to do that. It worked for that project. It was a fun little thing to do, and it came out pretty well. So I think just, first of all, go for it, which is sort of easy to say, but I think one piece of advice I would say is do an internship if you can afford to do it, if you have the time to do it. I was not able to do that. I was paying partially for my schooling and had a job and just couldn't make that happen. And I think that sort of, in retrospect, put me at a disadvantage to just being immersed in the world, especially not coming from a theater background. So I think, like any job, and what I said earlier, is like getting to know people, whether that is through an internship or just doing stuff like this, calling a theater and being like, hey, can I have a tour of your shop? Most of them probably would be thrilled to do it, especially if they know that you're interested in doing this work, because not a lot of people do. And I know that, like, on one hand, a job like I have is hard to come by, but once people get it, they often stay there for so long. And so if you're a shop manager who is looking to replace that position or needs a new craftsperson, there just isn't a lot of people out there, because I don't think a lot of people even know that's a possibility, especially if they don't have a class like this where they were able to hear about what it is. It's just sort of, mostly when I tell people what I do, they don't really understand what I do. So and I couldn't even really tell you half the time anyway, because it's always changing. So I think, yeah, just meeting people, asking questions, but then also just like, if you do have a passion for it, I do think doing it for fun, and it doesn't have to be with cosplay. It can be like, making hats. This is another just hat that I made to wear around town. And as hats are getting more popular now as a fashion thing, that's an avenue. It can be anything, like tie dyeing, indigo type dyeing, embroidery. I've done some of that before for a costume. But yeah, it's just, I think finding little projects that can be fun, especially when you don't have a job, as a hobby, it's a good thing to do, especially now when you're stuck inside. I think the only hard part is getting materials. That can sometimes be challenging, because they are sort of strange, but there's a lot of good resources, forums for costuming. If you are into like the more nerdy costume convention stuff, the Replica Prop Forum is a great place to pick up random um, techniques and advice. So there's always somebody, and now Instagram, honestly, if you just start following people, you know, whether it's hat makers, whether it's, you know, cosplayers or LARPers or whatever it is, you're just gonna be inspired by them. And I think, you know, don't be afraid to make something that looks kind of not very good the first time around, because like some of my first pictures, they're just cheesy now, you know, but that's when I was learning. So yeah, I think there's a lot of avenues you can go down, but the most important thing is just really love it and just keep doing it and learning new things and meeting a lot of people who can hopefully give you a leg up. And asking, you know, people who have done it before, whether it's a forum or in person, just being like, I think a great place to start would be like, hey, I have this idea for a project. I want a hat like this. I want a belt like this. I want a garment like this. What's the best place to start? Where would you start? Especially, you know, if you were in my shoes and maybe don't have access to all these materials. There's a lot of stuff out there and a lot of cheap materials too. I mean, one thing also that cosplay has kind of shown in this world is that you can make amazing looking things out of just kids craft foam. Is like readily available at Michael's or any store as soon as they reopen, and it's, you know, you get a roll of that, the world is your oyster. There's plenty of tutorials online. You can make any armor hat. I've seen people make all sorts of things. So, you know, there are some materials that as you get into professional theater and film, you're going to want to use that are a little more expensive, but it's amazing what you can do on a budget, especially now that there is such a wealth of resources available to people who want to make this stuff. So